Greetings, my lovable weirdos, and happy Halloween! Is anyone doing anything tonight? Are you going out trick-or-treating or going to haunted houses? By the time this video goes up, I'm actually going to be traveling with my family, so I will be doing none of those things. But I would love to know what you guys are getting up to, so let me know in the comments down below so that I can live vicariously through you. If you're new here, hi, I'm Tilly, and you can follow me on Instagram at TillyCXZ to get updates on this channel, or if you're curious as to how I do my makeup. Otherwise, you can follow me at MatildaCXZ if you're curious about my life outside of YouTube. If you're not new, welcome back to my channel where I talk about the weird, paranormal, and allegedly true stories that have gone on to inspire pop culture. Just a reminder, if you guys found my channel through these videos and missed the initial vlog about this is not only the last upload for October, but going forward, the upload schedule is going to be 1 or 2 videos a month, depending on how busy I get. As most of you know, this is a hobby for me, and I work in an industry that's kind of unpredictable. So, this upload schedule is to prevent me from getting burnt out, as has happened before. Anyway, on with the episode! Let's take a stroll down memory lane. Back to the decade that gave us big crimped hair, eye-watering fluorescent fashion, and some of the most memorable cult classics to ever hit the big screen. That's right, we're going back to the 80s. The 1980s was a great time for pop culture. The 80s saw the release of video game classics such as Super Mario Bros., Pac-Man, The Legend of Zelda, Tetris. It saw the rise of hip-hop and punk rock. It gave us TV shows like The Golden Girls and The A-Team. And of course, the 80s saw the release of iconic movies such as Ghostbusters, Back to the Future, and Top Gun. In fact, the 80s would see the rise of the Spielberg era, with the director/producer/screenwriter Steven Spielberg releasing The Goonies, E.T., and of course, the Indiana Jones franchise. Today, we're looking at the Spielberg movie that was apparently based on 2 separate real-life events, and would allegedly go on to be plagued by its very own curse. This week, I'm talking about the 1982 cult classic, Poltergeist. Warning: the following presentation contains references to the paranormal, death, mentions of murder, abuse, and medical misdiagnosis, and spoilers for the movie Poltergeist. Viewer discretion is advised. Originally conceived as a sequel to his 1977 science fiction movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Poltergeist was released in the United States on June 4, 1982. Written and produced by Spielberg and directed by Tobe Hooper of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre fame, the movie tells the story of a suburban family who suddenly seem to have some otherworldly visitors in their home. While these ghosts seem harmless and friendly at first, things quickly go downhill when these ghosts start to terrorize them and kidnap their young daughter, Carol Anne. Poltergeist would go on to be nominated for Oscars in the Best Visual Effects, Best Sound Effects, and Best Original Score categories, but would end up losing to Spielberg's other film, E.T., which was released just 1 week after Poltergeist. Fun fact, the filming locations for Poltergeist and E.T. were apparently only 20 minutes away from each other, which allegedly allowed Spielberg to travel back and forth between sets and work on Poltergeist whenever E.T. was experiencing delays. There's a bit of a scandal as to who actually directed Poltergeist, but I'm not going to dive into that for this video. But if you're curious, I'll link an article in the description box down below that talks more about that. Although Poltergeist didn't win any Academy Awards, it did win the Saturn Award for Best Horror Film, Best Makeup, and Best Supporting Actress for Zelda Rubinstein, who plays the psychic medium Tangina. It would go on to be the highest grossing horror film of 1982, make it onto the American Film Institute's list of top 100 most heart-pounding American movies, and be remembered for iconic lines such as, "They're here." But did you know that Poltergeist was apparently inspired by a real-life event that took place in 1958 that would go on to not only become a police case, but was apparently the event that brought the word poltergeist into popular lingo? In 1958, the Herrmann family were living in the town of Seaford, Long Island, New York. James M. Herrmann worked for Air France and has been described as, quote, a calm and hard-headed individual, end quote. His wife, Lucille Herrmann, was a non-practicing registered nurse, described as, quote, a practical, intelligent, and quiet woman, end quote. The couple had 2 children, a 13-year-old daughter also named Lucille, and a 12-year-old son, James Jr. Yes, James and Lucille did seem to have named their kids after themselves. And just so I'm not confused in this video, I'm going to be calling the parents Mr. and Mrs. Herrmann, and calling the kids Lucille and James Jr. The Herrmanns resided at 1648 Redwood Path. It was a 3-bedroom typical suburban home in a housing development where similar houses stood about 75 feet apart. The Herrmanns were the first residents of their home, having bought it new in 1953. By the way, another fun fact. The Herrmann house in Seaford was apparently only 7 miles or 11 kilometers away from the Amityville horror house. At 3:30 p.m. on February the 3rd, something strange started happening in the Herrmann household. It was a Monday, so Mr. Herrmann was at work, but Mrs. Herrmann and both their children were at home. Suddenly, they heard the sound of popping all throughout the house, almost like corks popping out of champagne bottles. When they went to investigate the source of the noise, Mrs. Herrmann and her children found that a bottle of holy water had somehow become uncapped and had tipped over in her bedroom. Something similar had happened to a bottle of shampoo and a bottle of medicine in the bathroom, a bottle of liquid starch in the kitchen, and a bottle of bleach in the basement. All the bottles had plastic or metal screw caps, and none of the contents were carbonated. Like the character of Diane Freeling in the movie, Mrs. Herrmann was actually more amazed and curious than frightened about what happened. She did decide to call her husband in his office in New York City to ask him what he thought might have caused the bottles to pop, and this was apparently his reply. Quote, "I am 35 miles away, dear. How should I know what's going on around there? Well, as long as no one has been hurt and no great damage done, I won't come home early." End quote. Which I find kind of hilarious, but I also think demonstrates that Mr. Herrmann was allegedly a no-nonsense, level-headed guy. By the time he got home that evening, it seemed like his family had gotten over the weird incident. A couple days passed, and then on Thursday, February the 6th, at around the same time in the afternoon, the exact same thing happened. Bottles popped open and tipped over seemingly on their own. And the same thing would happen the very next day. With these first 3 incidences, it was always Mrs. Herrmann and the children at home, because Mr. Herrmann was at work. But then on Sunday, February the 9th, Mr. Herrmann would allegedly witness something firsthand. At around 11 a.m. that Sunday, Mr. Herrmann was standing in the doorway of the bathroom talking to James Jr., who was brushing his teeth. Suddenly, before his very eyes, a bottle of medicine seemed to move on its own. It allegedly slid 18 inches in a southerly direction across the sink top and smashed into the sink. At the same time, a bottle of medicine slid 12 inches in a westerly direction across the same sink top and fell onto the floor. The sink top was apparently dead level, and Mr. Herrmann swears that no one was standing near the bottles and there were no devices in the bathroom that could have caused the bottles to move on their own. That same day, the bottle of holy water popped open again, as did a bottle of starch and a bottle of turpentine. Well, now that Mr. Herrmann had witnessed these things for himself, he decided to call the police. And they were understandably skeptical about the whole thing. But Mr. Herrmann had no history of calling in weird complaints. He was considered a respected member of the community, and he was a reserve captain of the police. So the Nassau County Police sent over Patrolman James Hughes to investigate. And while Patrolman Hughes was in the Herrmann house, more bottles started popping in the bathroom. This was apparently enough for the Nassau County Police to take the case seriously, and they assigned the case to a Detective Sergeant Joseph Tozzi, who has been described as having, quote, "a sharp and pleasantly cynical mind, and is a keen observer of detail," end quote. Being a practical man who didn't believe in the supernatural, Detective Tozzi apparently believed that, yes, the bottles were moving, but there had to be a scientific explanation for it. There was either a hoax, or someone was doing it, or it was a hallucination. For the next several days, bottles continued to pop open and move on their own. A globe that was on a bookcase in James Jr.'s bedroom fell onto the floor. Lucille and James Jr. were in the living room with their aunt, Mr. Herrmann's cousin, when a porcelain figure apparently rose up from a table, moved 3 feet in the air, and then fell onto a rug. On February the 17th, Father William MacLeod of the Church of St. William the Abbot in Seaford came to bless the house. He and the Herrmanns apparently discussed the possibility of having an exorcism performed, but Father MacLeod explained that exorcisms were usually performed on an individual rather than on a house or a physical place, and the rite had to be authorized by a Catholic bishop and performed by a priest of high spiritual order. Basically, exorcisms were rare. and they were unlikely to get one. By this time, word had gotten out that something weird was happening in the Herrmann house. Somehow the newspapers got a hold of the story, and reporters and photographers and radio and television hosts started turning up at the house. They were also receiving letters and other visitors who had advice or who claimed to have experienced something similar or who were just curious as to what was going on. Some of this were people genuinely trying to be helpful, like 74-year-old Helen Connolly from Revere, Massachusetts, who sent the Herrmanns a letter saying that she had experienced something similar in her house where the furniture started moving around in her living room. She claimed that she found the cause of this was actually a downdraft from her chimney, and she was able to solve the problem with a metal chimney cap. Detective Tozzi actually interviewed her on the phone, and to him, she seemed like a reasonable woman, so they actually tried her advice. Unfortunately, it didn't work. Of course, the Herrmann story also attracted other, less helpful people, like the man who showed up at their house on February the 18th. First impressions of him were that he was a dignified gentleman because he was wearing a suit and looked all proper, but when he made his way into the dining room of the Herrmann house, he suddenly threw himself onto his knees, cried out that he was a holy man from Santa Mauritius, prayed for 10 minutes straight, and then just as suddenly got up. And as he left the house, he told the Herrmanns, quote, "Everything is all right. You have been forgiven." End quote. And then he just drove off. So, safe to say, the Herrmanns were dealing with a lot, and it was about to get worse. On February the 20th, the unexplainable occurrences started to escalate. The cap of an ink bottle loudly popped open, but this time, instead of just moving around a little bit and tipping over, it allegedly flew across the dining room and smashed against the wall. In the living room, a porcelain figurine smashed against a desk. Detective Tozzi himself apparently witnessed a sugar bowl fly off the dining room table, but it didn't break. He claimed that no one had been close enough to the bowl at that time to have had physically thrown it. On February the 24th, a heavy bureau, which is like a chest of drawers, fell over onto the floor in James Jr.'s bedroom. Detective Tozzi had apparently been in the house at the time and was certain that no one had been anywhere near the room when the bureau fell. That same day, there was a reporter in the house from Newsday, a Mr. David Kahn. He was in the living room around 9 p.m. when he allegedly witnessed the globe that was from James Jr.'s room come bouncing out of the room and up to the chair where he was sitting in.
There was a lot of suspicion that the kid was doing it or that there were some hanky-panky going on, and I wanted to see what the actual situation was, and they invited me over. That was the night I was positioning myself in the living room facing Jim Herrmann's room, the boy's room, and out from that room flew a globe of the world.
On the morning of February the 25th, when the Herrmann's bedroom was apparently unoccupied, an 18-inch plaster statue of the Virgin Mary was apparently flung 12 feet across the room. It struck a mirror, denting the wooden frame, but apparently the glass didn't break and the statue was not damaged. That same evening, when James Jr. was doing his homework alone in the playroom in the basement, a 10-pound phonograph, which is about 4.5 kilograms, was suddenly flung off its table 15 feet across the room.
The phonograph flew from this table across the room, hit the shadow box, and made a dent here. And of course, my brother and I missed playing this phonograph very much, and it landed on the floor and broke.
At one point in the middle of all this, the Herrmanns left their house briefly, just to get away from everything. Apparently, while they were gone, nothing odd happened, and it was quiet in the house. But the moment they got back, things were suddenly flying around and breaking again. The attention the family were receiving got to the point where they were getting 25 letters and about 75 phone calls a day. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't particularly like answering phone calls. So if I were getting 75 phone calls a day, I would be so mad. Like, I would hate that. Anyway, some of the messages people were sending them said things like, quote, "Dear people, you are being visited by those from space. Speak friendly to them. They come for America's good." End quote. Quote, "Herrmann, I was read about your trouble in the paper. Sound like it could be ghostlies, and ghostly don't like sulfur. Burn some in every room, and if it ghostly, it will go away." End quote. Quote, "Dear Herrmann, have you considered opening your weird house to the public and charging admission?" End quote. By this point, the Herrmanns had in fact opened up their house to anyone who could possibly help them, though I don't think they were charging admission.
We opened our house to every qualified investigator who was interested. Scientists, engineers, those who might come up with a legitimate answer.
It was around this time, at the height of the activity, that the suggestion that it might be a poltergeist started coming in from the callers and the letter writers. And with that suggestion came the assumption that if what was happening had a supernatural element to it, maybe the Herrmanns were involved in the occult. And so the messages they were receiving from people started asking them questions like, quote, "I have had 43 fires in my place of business in one night. Can you tell me the reason?" End quote. Like they thought maybe the Herrmanns had some preternatural knowledge if they were communing with the other side. The activity in the Herrmann household had also caught the attention of Dr. Joseph Gator Pratt. He was a psychologist from Duke University who specialized in the field of parapsychology. In fact, he was the assistant of Dr. Joseph Banks Ryan, who founded parapsychology as a branch of psychology and who ran the parapsychology lab at Duke. Over the span of 30 years, Dr. Ryan collected sound scientific evidence that supported the theory that, under certain circumstances, some people had the ability to influence matter without touching it. Basically, psychokinesis. Although Dr. Ryan's work has been largely discredited these days, his work was actually hugely influential on science fiction, especially after John Wood Campbell Jr., who was a writer and editor for Astounding Science Fiction, became obsessed with Dr. Ryan's theories about psionic powers and human evolution. But back to the story. So Dr. Ryan's assistant, Dr. Pratt, arrived in Seaford on the same day that the phonograph flew across the room, February the 25th. He was accompanied by Dr. William George Rowe, who's most noted for coining the term recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, or RSPK, to explain poltergeist activity. Now, people had started to make the connection that whenever there was a large spike of activity in the Herrmann household, it always seemed to somehow be connected to James Jr. The heavy chest of drawers that fell over was in his room, the globe that kept falling over belonged to him, he was the only witness who saw the phonograph being flung 15 feet, and he was there in the bathroom when Mr. Herrmann saw the bottles moving for the first time. So some people were starting to be suspicious of James Jr., and thinking maybe this was the boy pranking everyone. After all, James Jr. was considered exceptionally bright. He was an honor roll student, he knew how to build models of things, and he read science fiction. And to some people, that was suspicious. But Detective Tozzi, who, remember, was considered a no-nonsense cop, didn't think James Jr. was responsible. Other people had also started to connect James Jr. to the activity, but under the theory that some children may possess psychokinetic powers without even realizing it. After all, this was not the first incidence of poltergeist activity in the United States, but it was the most widely covered one. And a lot of the alleged poltergeist activity that had been recorded at the time seemed to consistently take place in households with adolescent children. And remember, Lucille was only 13 and James Jr. was only 12 at the time. So Dr. Pratt, as a parapsychologist, wanted to observe what was happening for himself. He spent a lot of time with James, shadowing him around the house, playing games with him in the same room where the phonograph incident took place, just to see if the same thing would happen. Now, I found conflicting information about what exactly happened during Dr. Pratt's stay in the Herrmann house. A Life magazine article printed in March 1958, just 1 month after the events first took place in the Herrmann house, claimed that nothing happened during his stay. But an academic paper written by Dr. Roll and Dr. Pratt himself, published in the Journal of Parapsychology, Volume 22, Number 2, in June of 1958, claimed that while they were in the house, a lamp fell over in the master bedroom, a bread plate fell off the dining room table, there were unexplainable thumping noises throughout the house, the cap had popped off a bottle of bleach in the basement, and that same bottle had moved from where it was last placed. This is a 35-page paper, not including the appendix, that does examine several hypotheses, like, could this be a childish prank? Is this a hoax that the entire family is involved in? Or was it an actual scientific explanation for what was going on? But ultimately, the paper does lean more into the suggestion that maybe there's a parapsychological explanation for everything.
Dr. Pratt, what brought you to Seaford?
The typical poltergeist case centers around some youngster in the turbulent teens. Certainly, it is always associated with some living person. The Seaford case may have great significance for our research if we could not explain these incidents in ordinary psychological terms, such as hallucinations, or pranks, then the possibility remained that they might be parapsychological.
It is interesting to note, however, that Dr. Pratt's paper does claim that he proposed that the Herrmanns take a polygraph test to help in their investigation. And allegedly, the family declined. Mr. and Mrs. Herrmann were apparently reluctant to put their children through such a test, and the children themselves apparently objected to taking it. Either way, Dr. Pratt's visit actually marked the decline of paranormal activity in the Herrmann house. There were a few more occurrences here and there, but eventually everything just stopped, just as suddenly as it began. Altogether, the disturbances in the Herrmann household lasted just over a month. In the 2012 documentary, Real Fear, The Truth Behind the Movies, the daughter Lucille claims that this is actually still an open police case because they never figured out what was going on. I actually found it a little bit sad because Detective Tozzi's son appears in the documentary, and he claims that his father was bothered by the fact that he was never able to solve the case. He was never able to close the case. Like, up until his deathbed, he was still thinking about this case. But he does say that he thinks his father became a believer in the paranormal because there was no other explanation that he could think of as to why everything was happening. So what do you think? Was it a hoax or was it an actual paranormal event? Either way, because of the similarities between the Herrmann case and some of the events of the movie Poltergeist, people do believe that the movie is at least partly inspired by what happened in Seaford in 1958. Now, the second true event allegedly has an influence on the big twist at the end of the movie. If you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, this will be a spoiler.
You son of a bitch, you moved the cemetery, but you left the bodies, didn't you? You son of a bitch, you left the bodies and you only moved the headstones! You only moved the headstones!
This plot twist is allegedly based on what happened in Cheesman Park in Denver, Colorado. The park's history dates back to the founding of the city of Denver in 1858. Prospectors from St. Charles, Missouri laid claim to the land at the mouth of Cherry Creek, but then made the mistake of heading home to Missouri. While they were gone, gold seekers led by General William Larimer basically stole their claim. But the problem was that the land that both the St. Charles prospectors and General Larimer had laid claim to had actually been promised to the Native American Arapaho and Cheyenne tribes in the Treaty of Fort Laramie, aka the Horse Creek Treaty, in 1851. I say promised, but this had always been Native American land. The treaty was basically the US government acknowledging the boundaries of Native American land and saying that they didn't lay claim to any of it. But they pretty much immediately broke that treaty, especially once the gold rush happened. So in 1858, General Larimer basically jumped someone else's claim and founds the city of Denver. Winter of that same year, he chooses the site that will become Mount Prospect Cemetery, the city's first organized cemetery. And the site that he chose just so happened to be one of the burial grounds of the Arapaho tribe. Apparently none of the bodies were ever moved, and they just dug up the burial grounds to bury more bodies on top of the bodies that were already there. In 1872, the city of Denver applied to Congress for the title to the land, and the US government determined that this had always been federal land, and if Denver wanted to, they could buy it for $200. So that's what they did. The cemetery was divided into different areas for different religions, ethnic groups, and fraternal organizations. It continued to be used as a cemetery all the way until 1890, when Colorado Senator Henry Moore Teller convinced Congress that they should turn it into a park instead, because by this time, there were more cemeteries in Denver that were being used more often instead. So on January 25th, 1980, Congress authorized for Mount Prospect Cemetery to be vacated, and Senator Teller renamed the area Congress Park. Families had 90 days to move the bodies of their loved ones to other cemeteries. But not everyone could afford it. Congress may have ordered for Mount Prospect Cemetery to be cleared, but the families had to pay for the removal of the remains themselves. The city waited 3 years for the remains to be claimed, and then in 1893, they contracted undertaker E.P. McGovern to clear the over 5,000 bodies that were still unclaimed. He was supposed to provide a fresh coffin for each body and transfer the remains to Riverside Cemetery, and this was supposed to have cost $1.90 each. So the work began on March 14, 1893, and drew the attention of reporters and the morbidly curious. At first, things seemed to be going well, But then McGovern allegedly realized that he could make more profit if he squeezed the remains into 3.5 foot by 1 foot child-sized coffins instead. In order to do this, McGovern and his crew apparently hacked up the bodies, and because they were trying to save time and money, not all the body parts of the same body ended up in the same coffin. It was basically really disorganized, and there were body parts and bones scattered everywhere. And on top of this, McGovern was allegedly allowing people to ransack the bodies and take home souvenirs. So people were just taking jewelry and fine clothing fabrics off the bodies. Coincidentally, when Congress was accepting bids for the job of clearing out Mount Prospect Cemetery, McGovern was apparently the lowest bidder. The Denver Republican newspaper ran a story about what was happening on March 19, 1893, just 5 days after work began. This led to McGovern's contract being cancelled, a temporary wooden fence being built around the cemetery, and the city's health commissioner beginning an investigation. A new contract for the removal of the remaining bodies was never issued. But plans for turning Mount Prospect Cemetery into Congress Park continued. In 1894, grading and leveling of the area began in preparation for the park, although several of the graves were still open and weren't filled until 1902. Although the numbers vary, it is said that about 4,200 bodies still remain buried under the park. In 1907, Walter Scott Cheesman died and was buried in Fairmount Cemetery near Congress Park. He was a real estate and railway baron who basically helped turn Denver into the major city that it is. He was also responsible for the organization of Denver's water supply, building dams, reservoirs, and filtration and distribution systems. Cheesman had a reputation for being a generous man and was known to aid children and animals in need. He was the president of the Colorado Humane Society, whose goal was to end cruelty to children and animals. And he also supported the Juvenile Improvement Society, which was an organization that publicized the needs of underprivileged children. All in all, he sounds like he was a great guy. So when his wife and his daughter donated a pavilion to the city of Denver as a memorial in his honor, the city was more than happy to rename a large area of Congress Park to Cheesman Park, which is how Walter Cheesman now has his name associated to a desecrated burial ground. And those are the 2 real-life events that allegedly inspired Steven Spielberg's movie Poltergeist. Now, Spielberg has never come out to confirm or deny if he was inspired by the Herrmann poltergeist or the history of Cheesman Park, but it hasn't stopped people from believing that he was. Either way, Poltergeist will go on to spur 2 sequels and a 2015 remake of the original movie, although the ratings for that were not as good. It would also go on to inspire its own urban legend, based on the fact that real human skeletons were allegedly used in one of the scenes, and the fact that an exorcism was performed on the set of the sequel. It is believed that the Poltergeist Curse is responsible for the deaths of multiple cast members, including Dominique Dunne, who played the eldest daughter Dana Freeling, and Heather O'Rourke, who starred as young Carol Anne. Just 5 months after the first movie was released, Dominique Dunne was strangled in her own driveway by an abusive ex-boyfriend after she turned down his attempts at reconciliation. She subsequently fell into a coma and tragically had to be taken off life support on November 4th, 1982. Dominique was only 22 at the time. Unbelievably, her murderer only got 6 years in prison and was released after serving only 3.5 years. 12-year-old Heather O'Rourke had a birth defect that was misdiagnosed as Crohn's disease, leading to her suddenly passing away from cardiac arrest caused by septic shock due to her severe intestinal obstruction. Her mother would later sue her doctors, and the lawsuit would be settled outside of court. It's been 40 years since Poltergeist was first released. Vanity Fair recently published an article interviewing JoBeth Williams and Craig T. Nelson, who played the Freeling parents. In the interview, Williams talks about how she found out that the skeletons weren't from the props department, and they both reminisce about working with Heather and Dominique on set and how they found out about their deaths. I'll link that in the description box below if you're interested in reading it. And that's it for this week's episode. I know it's a long one, but I hope you guys enjoyed it anyway. Let me know in the comments down below what you'd like me to talk about next. And remember, going forward, it's going to be 1 episode a month so that I can balance this and work and not get burned out. I hope you're all having a wonderful Halloween, and until next time, stay hydrated, take care of each other, and remember to keep on embracing your inner weirdo. Bye!